This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to this public John Coffin Memorial event. My name is Winston. I'm from the University of England, here at Nebraska. And it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Jane Landman from Victoria University of Melbourne. Before I do that, I should say a little about the nature of the John Coffin Memorial event. I've been given a piece of paper. It's moderately mysterious, I have to say, but I shall share it with you. The Institute of the School of Advanced Studies hosts John Coffin Memorial events on behalf of all the colleges of the University of London in fulfilment of a gift by Mr. Collins' son, Arthur Charles, one time Chief Education Officer in Bradford, who before the Second World War had close connections with the University of London. I quote now from all that is preserved of him in the institutional memory. I think those of us in the hall who have served our places of learning should take note of this as being the best we can hope for. It says, Mr. Coffin was concerned that, in the growing intensity of specialisation in modern times, we should not lose sight of music, the arts, and what he termed the cultural aspects of education, and not the least of good general teaching on sound religious basis. In addition to a part of the bequest devoted to lectures in Christian ethics, history, literature, and science, other parts are earmarked for literary readings of prose or poetry, chamber concerts or recitals, and for the publication of reports by the Institution of Education. Mr. Coffin further states in his will that he desired each event to be announced as part of the John Coffin Memorial, and it therefore appears likely that the bequest is in memory of his father. I think that's entirely admirable, and we should thank him and honour his memory hereby. Beyond this, I'm afraid, very little is known, either of John or Arthur Coffin, and that's all I can tell you. So thank you, Mr. Coffin and Mr. Coffin's father. I think I'm on firmer ground talking about Jane. This is a sort of Venn diagram where two circles overlap. One is the subject of this conference, which is the image of the monarchy, arranged by Madonna. That would be one circle. And the other is documentary film. And I come from that other circle. Jane is the Venn in the middle. Since she's going to talk about documentaries and the monarchy. Jane is a senior lecturer in the School of Communication and the Arts at Victoria University in Melbourne, as I said. She's the author of The Tread of a White Man's Foot, Australian Pacific Colonisation and the Cinema, which was published in 2006. And with Chris Ballard, she's written New Guinea Patrol documentary on Australian colonialism, which is in hand. Her current research concerns the role of the cinema in the process and cultures of colonising and decolonisation, focusing on the government documentary films made in the territories of Papua New Guinea in the 50s and 60s. And her plan is that further work would address the imperial mass communications in decolonising Western Pacific with regard to Australia and various British-derived colonial administrations. And I can add, from the point of view of documentary studies, that we have paid little coherent attention to the use of film, firstly in the British Empire and then in the British Commonwealth. Recently, there's been a major study on film in the Empire, and we're still working on trying to bring together the various strands of scholarship most developed in Australia, in Canada rather, slightly less developed in Australia, and frankly not developed at all in very many other places, trying to bring those together as a basis for looking at this next stage, which Jane has made already significant contributions to. So, without more ado, I ask you to join me in welcoming Jane Landman. Let me say that we will not take questions, formal occasion, academic occasion. We only have remarks, but we are invited, in memory of the Coffin family, to take drinks outside, and you're all welcome to do that. Thank you. So, Jane Landman.
And I'd like to thank Mandy and Brian for bringing me here from the colonies to talk about our royal summer today. In the abstract that I wrote for this conference, I cited 2 reviews of the 1954 film The Queen in Australia, one saying, "We must regard it as by far the most important contribution that film has ever made to world affairs," and another predicting that if The Queen in Australia could be shown inside the Iron Curtain for a week, future conferences might shape up very differently. Such hyperbole was entirely consonant with the extravagant reportage of the royal tour of 53-54. In both journalism of the time and in subsequent analyses, writers exhaust reserves of superlatives in attempting to convey the scale of the tour's magnificence, the sincerity of the waving and cheering crowd celebration, which was estimated to amount, the crowds that came to see the Queen, to 75% of the Australian population. These crowds, as they filled stadia, city streets, and assembled in remarkable numbers at remote whistle stops across the 57 days of Australia's so-called royal summer. And I'm going to start off by showing you the start of the film. This segment goes for about 5.5 minutes, but I think it sets things up for the rest of my talk.
The Southern Cross has vanished in the north. Over the city of Sydney, the brilliance of a summer's day is broken. It is the 3rd of February, 1954. A day of high summer and of high history for Australia. There'll be no work done today in Sydney. 1 million of us are on the move, swarming into the streets like bees in the sun. The city and the continent are waiting. And at its edge, the Governor-General and the Prime Minister are waiting too. For a Queen is coming. A Queen we have never seen. Out of the morning sun steams the royal liner Coffin. Out of the Tasman Sea into the majesty of Sydney Harbour. The first ship ever to pass between the heads, flying the royal stamp. those 6 states. They speak for giant Queensland, beneath its Capricorn horizons, carpeted with sugarcane. For Victoria, where channel and dam and sluice have wrested increase from the tawny soil. For boundless Western Australia, where the axes sound through the towering Karri forests. They speak for New South Wales, with its blue mountain ramparts, with its broad-breasted rivers rolling down to the Pacific. For South Australia, for the vineyards of its wine country, loaded with their smoked blue grapes. For its clanging shipyards, risen from a bed of iron ore on the arid coastal flats. For Lake lovely Tasmania, encircled by the southern seas. They speak for a land of shy and gentle creatures, of the marsupial survivors of a time-lost world, of the emu pacing his savan in sand, of the lazy, lovable koala cuddling the gum tree in his furry arms. They speak for a continent among the oldest in its being, among the freshest and most fruitful in its modern doing, where wiry stockmen ride cattle stations 5 times and more the size of Cornwall or County Clare, where the sheep move like rivers on the plains, like white clouds across the hills. They speak, above all, for a new nation, flexing its muscles, filling its spaces, inheriting its own, never complete, never content, growing, enriching, expanding. To this ancient continent, to this youthful nation, they bid their sovereign and her husband welcome. And now, in the presence of the Premier of New South Wales, with all Australia listening, the Lord Mayor of Sydney speaks.
May it please your most gracious Majesty, we, the Lord Mayor and Aldermen, on behalf of the citizens of Sydney, loyal and dutiful subjects, desire to offer to your Majesty and His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh, our most sincere and affectionate welcome.
Thank you. So, if you think of the line in that clip I just showed you, there will be no work done today. With this opening montage, the Queen in Australia pauses time. It had been a long wait for this first visit to the dominion of a ruling monarch, a tour twice delayed by those factors, her father George VI's illness and then death, that resulted in Elizabeth's coronation in 1952. Elizabeth was the first ascendant monarch bearing the title of head of Commonwealth. This pause makes way for the space-time of the film, the chronotope of the royal summer, where, and I'm quoting Buckton here, time thickens, takes on flesh, and becomes artistically visible. Opening in the East Coast morning and closing in the West Coast evening at Fremantle, the film orders and compresses ritual displays and relentless travel in a theme-based montage, moulding space to the movements of time and plot, creating a history of the present. This paper concerns the production and organisation of space-time in the Queen in Australia as an exemplary statement about nation within Commonwealth. It's a film made at the high point of Commonwealth celebration in the early 1950s. It's a film made by a film unit steeped in modes of public communication institutionalised in Britain and exported variously to overseas territories. And thematically, it concerns the unities of a de-dominionising Australia under the umbrella of a new Commonwealth, performatively articulating continuities as well as post-war relations. My focus is on the institutionalized discourse of social, and particularly racial, relations within this national Commonwealth story. The film and the tour are events in what Patrick Wolfe calls the endless catalogue of settler colonialism's ongoing cultural labour in reproducing and tweaking racial constructs to ensure the reproduction of historical relations into the present. I'm going to give a little bit of context in this next section. I've described this as a rebranding tour as part of public relations initiatives concerned with repositioning Britain and its imperial relations after World War II. This was a period of focused policy concern in Britain about overseas information services, heightened in the intense battle for hearts and minds of the Cold War. So it's an extension and a renewal of the notion of propaganda for good that we see in the 1930s and in the wartime periods. There was a series of major investigations into the efficacy, the priorities, the policy and the operations of the British Information Service, the British Council and the BBC throughout the 1950s and 1960s, which were of particular concern to the Commonwealth Relations Office, the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office. In contrast, Australian overseas information services were risible in scale and indifferently supported by the long-term Liberal Menzies government. I should say that a Liberal government in Australia is a Conservative government. It was a Conservative, but it was a Conservative Party. Nevertheless, the Menzies government maintained an information service concerned about relations with Asia and defending Australia's colonial record at the UN. Colonialism, as Priya Jacob once noted, had become embarrassing. In 1950, in a major statement, UNESCO described racism as a particularly vicious and mean expression of the caste spirit. A response, clearly, was a response to World War II, or the events of World War II, but very much resonated in the colonies and in the surveillance of those policies and practices in UN trusteeships established after the war, of which one was New Guinea. The new Commonwealth came into being in the interests of securing an ongoing Commonwealth relationship with Republic of India. So the so-called London Declaration in April 1949 opened up the possibility of flexible constitutional relationships in respect to the British Crown for future member states achieving independence. It was a new form of association that has variously been described as a buffer during the transitions of decolonisation. An Overseas Information Services review in the 1960s, early 1960s, described the Commonwealth as a vital aspect of British policy that already constitutes a bridge between the races, the West and the uncommitted world. It was a two-way buffer, shoring up Britain's ongoing international influence in light of its waning power and buffering against the political encroachments of communism. I'm quoting Marshall in that last point. And I just have to in a Coronation Souvenir edition of the Australian Sun, while delighting in the extensive red tints of the globe that are still extensively red, quaintly describes Elizabeth as, and it's this article, as monarch recessional of empire into the march of progress. Passing over local infestations, this article lauds the magical metamorphosis of empire to Commonwealth, and it lauds this as a triumph of the liberal humanities. Yet this almost incoherent phrasing speaks to the fragility of this new order, which the tour and the film implicitly address. The Queen in Australia renews bonds of loyalty and commemorates shared histories, and the reiteration of such scenes across and within the nations and colonies that she visits performatively stitches together territories of the Commonwealth into this unified free world. This freshly minted young queen, in the manner of those film stars that Richard Dyer discusses in his pioneering work on celebrity, reconciles or at least contains contradictions in her very embodiment. Her figuration as White Mother is at the heart of this renewal. Through her patrimony and her fertility, she links tradition and the modern future, the everyday femininity of wife and mother, and fairy tale privilege, the free world and the world of empire. In speeches in the British colonies of Fiji and Tonga, the Queen renews to these territories the protective mantle first proffered by Queen Victoria. In many sites on this tour, a finely calibrated symbolism was carefully negotiated behind the scenes. The condensations, repressions, and elisions of tour rituals and tour films underline the enormously hopeful hubris of this magical thinking, a mode that could pass over colonial legacies and injustices, many of which haunt Australia still. Across these territories, floral motifs stitch the Commonwealth together in a manner that was naturalising and ornamental. Curator Peter Trepanier describes the coronation dress as an atlas of the Queen's realms. The flowers of the 11 Commonwealth countries were intertwined in a floral garland, each flower or leaf nestling around a Tudor rose. The Queen's coronation dress accompanied Elizabeth on tour and was worn to open various parliaments. Floral tributes from the Commonwealth's most youthful actualise these atlas embroideries, this decorative face of territorial unity. The abundant flower girls of the royal tour combine in their figuration the innocence of youth and the blameless fertility of nature, providing an acceptably feminized form of submission. These reiterated gestures are mirrored everywhere in the wreaths laid for the fallen, creating a gendered and historicised cycle of Commonwealth life. The analogue of the genuflecting girls is the ever-helpful proto-military Boy Scouts, a movement much associated with development initiatives in the colonies and certainly in PNG. Awkward bows and curtsies abound, humorously displacing residual power relations. So I can't think of another occasion on this particular tour where the Queen could advise one of her subjects bend the knee, dear, as she does in this image. For little settler girls, the daughters of civic dignitaries with some representatives of charity-based groups, being a flower girl is an experience in the subjunctive, a chance to participate in a dream of a fairy tale queen come to life, in the words of the Women's Weekly. There's something incipiently Republican in this nudging of crown symbolism into the realm of the childishly fantastic, a perspective that's also invited by the childish enthusiasms in the commentary of the Canadian royal film. But the little flower girls of the Pacific instead enact a re-enchantment with empire. The deeply loyalist Fiji Times, I should say probably for those of you that don't know, the Queen visited the two major British colonies, Fiji and Tonga, and then she goes to New Zealand and then comes to Australia for this long period, and then she visits the Cocos Islands on the way out, heading for Ceylon. The deeply loyalist Fiji Times, for example, in reporting on the Maori welcome to the historic Waitangi ground, the ground where the treaty was signed with the indigenous peoples of New Zealand, says, one of the most delightful parts of the ceremony took place when Auntie Aurora Rogers, a shy little Maori girl in full Maori dress, presented Her Majesty with a bouquet. She was obviously overawed. The Queen seemed pleased with the smallest of her Maori subjects. Earlier in Suva, in images that you've seen a little bit earlier in this clip, it's Adi May Ganalau who presents a bouquet of tropical flowers, and it's reported her wide eyes looked up at the Queen in grave and wondering admiration. It was a perfect opening to a day in Suva, to a day in which Suva, and indeed all the peoples of all the races in Fiji, were to lose their hearts completely. Not yet 4, she's the daughter of Adilesa and Ratu Panay Ganalau, who's now serving in Malaya as the second in command in the 1st Battalion. This re-enchanting PR moment covers over a tangled nexus of late colonial policy. Adi's father, and later Fiji's first president, would have been involved in the decade-long emergency, so-called emergency, against the communist Chinese Malays, against whom, post-independence, Indian troops were reluctant to fight, and I'm quoting Carolyn Elkins there. The Conservative Menzies government provided military support to this conflict, and the Australian News and Information Bureau supplied a consultant to the Colonial Office to advise the Malayan Film Unit on making anti-insurgency propaganda. Now I want to make one final point in this contextual section. The tour was a pause moment also in the sense of creating a deliberative space for a celebration of the present and the character of the national community. This started well before the tour with template tour scrapbooks which kind of prefigured the way in which one would remember the tour. There was this semiotic excess of commercial tie-ins and saturation reporting and the mobilizing of civic, political and commercial spheres, along with the depth of community participation in preparations and performances, securely anchored the tour's rites and rituals to the lives of ordinary people. States juggled the vested interests of districts, businesses, agencies and individuals, developing tour itineraries where local benefits converged with or were covered over by this outpouring of sentiment. And it's become a very salient reference moment in national memory, which has retrospectively been described as the last gasp of empire. And I'm just going to give one example here. In a recent Black Art production, a theatre production about the life of Albert Namanjera, who was an Aboriginal painter who was invited to meet the Queen, performed by his family, the Queen is figured as a quaint and rather queer icon of an alien empire, immeasurably divorced from the imposts of assimilation that blighted Indigenous lives. Now in this next section I'm going to talk about the making of the film. The film was to be a work that through its art would contain and extend the experience of the tour. The post-war period is one where the legacies of the British documentary movement of the 1930s played out in various film units established as part of public communication and cultural policy across the Commonwealth. The producer-in-chief of the film and the producer of The Queen in Australia was a self-described Grierson man. His name is Stanley Hawes. From his arrival in Australia in 1946, British-born Hawes maintained a steady correspondence with this leading documentary film movement figure, John Grierson, and he drew on Grierson for assistance in making The Queen in Australia. Hawes unwaveringly believed in the progressive role of documentary film in a civic education project tailored to the needs of a complex modern society. He also held to Grierson's views that an information service was, and this is quoting Grierson now, not simply ancillary to the other activities of government, but the chosen instrument by which a nation gives an account of its stewardship. It's the instrument through which it secures the cooperation of the people to national and international ends. It's the instrument by which a nation contributes to the international pool of understanding in matters of common interest. His commitment to all things Grierson shapes Hoare's own administrative, creative and apostolic work. So to an extent, these influences prefigure the institutionalised aesthetics of the new Commonwealth. I think that the Queen in Australia is best understood as Hoare's homage to Grierson and to his view that montage or assemblage can function as a reflection of social forms of organisation. Hoare writes to Grierson that the Queen in Australia represents something that we have believed in for 30 years. The grand old principle, this is a term they both use, the grand old principle where government documentary synthesised the communicative needs of government departments along with its own overarching and independent programme into films whose assemblages not only show but aesthetically enact the complex workings of modern society. So Hoare's accepted on faith, for example, Grierson's rather unlikely assertion that postal workers who'd seen the creative achievement night mail would feel assured and comforted by knowing their place in the greater scheme of things. And this idea of placing is terribly important. Hoare's and his unit had a great deal to prove with this project. They also needed a performance of loyalty and efficiency, and I won't go into the background reasons for that, but they are also linked to the Cold War, at least to some extent. From the outset, Hoare was concerned about competition from other royal films, of which there had been a glut in this 1950s pageant of coronations and progresses. So the benchmark film was The Queen is Crowned, the 1952 film, and the benchmarks, and the 1951 film, The Royal Tour of Canada by the Canadian Film Board, which had been much praised by Grierson. Hoare also confronted the daunting task of attempting, interestingly, to organise a lot of ceremonial and frankly rather dull material, as well as coping with equally representing the squabbling states of Australia. The New Zealand Film Unit, which also made The Queen in Tonga, and you can watch both the New Zealand Film Unit's film and The Queen in Tonga, which is a much sweeter film than anything I'm showing you today, came into exhibition just before the Queen in Australia, and these films were regarded as the principal competitors. The Queen in New Zealand was later blamed for queering the pitch for the superior art qualities of the Australian film by sating the market with dull newsreel. Every element of the production process of The Queen in Australia was to display Australian expertise and, in a minor key, Australian and UK ties. And I really do mean absolutely everything, right down to the location of where the film stock, which had to be sent to the UK as colour stock, couldn't be processed in Australia. Everything had to bear this out. The bulk of the film spend was to be in Australia, with only, and I'm quoting Hoare here, unavoidable editing and recording expenses to be incurred in the UK. Basing post-production in the UK saved time, as well as giving Hoare a chance to revisit his homeland and draw on assistance from filmmakers who he knew from his British documentary movement days in the 1930s. Hoare decided to order his film thematically to avoid repeating the usual chronological approach. He sought script assistance from another British documentary movement figure, Stuart Legg, for his expertise on the Commonwealth. And in January 1954, Legg writes to Hoare and says, "My hunch is to point the camera as much at what the Queen sees, and through that to the perspective of the country beyond, as at the Queen herself. Australia on parade, happy, laughing, humorous and good-humoured, gutsy, excited and exciting. Wonderful faces, places, plenty of candid close-ups." This emphasis was fortuitous, as casual or intimate footage of the Queen proved impossible in light of royal protocols and priorities. The Queen disliked the intrusions of glaring lights and cameras into her interactions with the public. The crew's negotiations with Commander Richard Conville, the Queen's press secretary, played out in the manner of a 1930s cine-sound film. These were popular comedies in Australia in the 30s. With Conville cast as the effete upper-crust British buffoon around whom dexterous larrikins were required to run rings. In reports to Hawes in London, the mobile crew describes him as the man with the built-in sneer. In an interesting reflection on this earlier period of Windsor media relations, the head of the News and Information Bureau later says of Conville, he's an able administrator who is much too restrictive. I feel that he does not realise that he must have a function to promote the Queen as well as to protect her. A lesson well learned by now. Grierson's writing reiteratively describes documentary as a form linked to supporting understanding of and illuminating the nation as a modern operating system. So in this next section, I consider how the nation's so-called primitive others figure in this system through the lens of the assimilationist policies of the day. Through the alchemy of assimilation, Patrick Wolfe writes, the social death of the native becomes the birth of the settler. The tour commences under the kitsch boomerang archway that you've seen twice by now, an Aboriginal sign pressed to speak the cultural truths of others. It's an early indication that the most consistent sign of assimilation is going to be appropriation. The royal party attend the Australian Ballet's production of Corroboree, a characteristically modernist project mining the primitive in an uncomfortable hybrid, a mode where it is found, in Nick Thomas's view, a mixture of awe, respect, partial understanding, and misrecognition. The film cuts to the so-called real thing, but instead shows another hybrid, a corroboree for the entertainment of the white crowd. Social death is played out in the gollywog dancers, threading their way through the mass loyalty display staged by the nation's children. Now, I don't know if you can see the gollywogs. We've had to zoom in very close. A whole section of kids in blackface. And in the misery on the faces of the Indigenous children in their matching suits, segregated from the crowd in a prominent display of stolen agency. All of these examples, historically and politically, locate Indigenous Australians in the space-time of the film. In a project that revels in moments of crowd spontaneity and movement, there is not one single shot of an Indigenous person who's just there as an incidental part of a milling crowd, for example. Under the concept of terra nullius, there is no single welcome to country from any Indigenous person, such as has occurred across all the other stops of the Pacific. Instead, each Indigenous and colonial subject is placed implicitly in what Anne McClintock calls archaic time, as in the scenes of the opening montage, along with the nation's shy marsupials, or in such scenes of this, of organised display. Now, much of this brief overview that I've given you is of a piece with dominant tropes structuring representations in this era that have been very well written about by Marcia Langton, for example. I wanted to part from this now in pursuing my focus on the putatively new in the Commonwealth's colonial associations. And I want to do this by tracing out the mechanics for including delegations from Papua and New Guinea into their place in the National Assemblage. They're minimally represented, and my focus instead is on how their inclusion was managed, and based on small hints available in the archive on tracing these delegates back to Papua and New Guinea. In Imperialism and Culture, Edward Said describes a contrapuntal reading as a method for, open quotes, reading a text with an understanding for what is involved when an author shows, for example, taking the example of Mansfield Park, for instance, that a sugar plantation is seen as important in the process of maintaining a particular lifestyle in England. So what was involved in securing these inclusive images of Australia's colonial subjects? The Federal Department of Territories, which at this stage encompassed the Northern Territory, was at this time led by Minister Paul Hasluck, who was the architect of Australia's assimilation policy. It was Hasluck's responsibility to set and to orchestrate an appropriate level of Indigenous involvement, and I take the term appropriate from his report. The principal part of this inclusion was small, representative, again his term, delegations from each of the territories. So these were the Northern Territory, Norfolk Island, Nauru, and Papua and New Guinea counted as one, who were formally represented at a royal party at Government House in Canberra. We don't see this in the film because of the restrictions I mentioned earlier. They weren't able to film this celebration. In these delegations, the parties were largely European administrators and their wives and some senior missionaries. So, for example, the Papua and New Guinea party of 13 included 2 native people and 1 Chinese. The Chinese had been brought to New Guinea by the prior German administration, but after Australian expropriation of New Guinea, which was Australia's first act of World War I, Australia applied the White Australia policy to New Guinea. You can get your head around that. And so there was no more translocated labour. So the Chinese person, I think, was included because at this time there was enormous anxiety expressed in the Rabaul papers. Rabaul was the administrative capital of New Guinea, and there was enormous anxiety expressed in those newspapers about how the Chinese youth weren't standing for the national anthem in the segregated but mixed-race cinema of the town. I think that this person was brought along to learn loyalty. A further delegation was brought to Cairns for a 2-day visit, which is we see briefly in the film loop. The minister's selection was all male and favoured cultural intermediaries, in other words, men with leadership potential in driving development policies, and those with loyalty expressed by war service. His report notes that this party in Cairns were given an unscheduled half hour of the Royals' time. There was also a cohort of Royal Papuan Constabulary along with their band who marched in the grand trooping ceremony of the time. I just have to go back in time a bit. Yes. Of the Northern Territory party of 8 to be presented at Government House, 6 were Europeans, the administrator, his wife, and 2 pioneering couples, along with 2 outstanding Aborigines, including the minister, one of whom was Albert Amangera that I mentioned earlier. One of the delegates in the image that I seem to be incapable of freezing on was a man named Simigan, a nominated member of the Papua and New Guinea Legislative Council, an ex-coast watcher, which means war experience, and a current member of the constabulary. It's not clear in the archival records to which of these parties Simmegan belongs. That I know anything about Simmegan's account of his experiences is due to the travel record of another government filmmaker, a man called Maslin Williams, who travelled extensively in Papua New Guinea, starting about a year after the making of this film. He travels for about 6 months in two different phases, researching for a series of films that has commissioned of the government filmmaking body. In his travels, Williams encounters various of these chosen representatives. He meets Simmegan in the Highlands and again in Port Moresby, the administrative centre of Papua. On his first encounter, Williams describes, his first encounter of meeting Simmegan, he describes the rare sight of, and I'm quoting, a nearly jet black and half-naked man lounging at ease across a table from the district officer, probably the only native, Williams says, to sit in a European's office in the territory. Simmegan's a small business entrepreneur. He runs a trucking business. He does a bit of gold sluicing on the side, and equally unusually, he owns a rifle. He uses actual papers to roll his cigarettes, not newspapers. Despite this relative affluence, he can't afford to live in Port Moresby, which is the location of the Legislative Council on which he sits. The story of note that Simmegan relates to Williams concerns a night of hard drinking with Albert Namatjira. He says he drank Namatjira under the table, truly. At this time, neither Namatjira or Simmegan were citizens of their respective countries. Neither had legal access to alcohol. Pacific historian Donald Danoon describes these proto-citizens of the territories of Papua and New Guinea as legally incompetent, citizens of neither their own country nor of Australia, and he notes that such rare visits to Australia as did occur operated as part of selective and tightly organised schemes where approvals required the support of the minister. So, for example, visits like this one. Williams' travel notes contain this paraphrased translation of what Simmegan discerned from his royal visit, which would have only half pleased the minister, I think. He says, "Some of us believe that the spirits will bring European goods to us in ships and planes." This is a reference to cargo cults that were very prevalent in PNG in the 1950s. I myself believed this at one time, but now I know that it's not true. You know, when I visited Australia, I saw that it was very different from what I expected to see. I found that a man who did not work did not eat. Unless we work hard and listen to the agricultural officer, our children might become labourers working for others. Welcome to the modern operating system indeed. All right, I just want to make some points in conclusion. Notwithstanding the lachrymose tones of the film's Farewell to Family, there was much relief when the Gothic set sailed. No one cheered louder than the exhausted film crew, all of whom had received a commemorative medal given to those members of the press who lasted for 4 stays or more. Australia moved into autumn, and Hawes, still tied up in post-production in London, is told by his correspondents, now that the Queen is on her way home, she seems practically to have slipped from public consciousness. And another correspondent, Sydney is talking of the Petrov affair and nothing else. And for those of you who mightn't know, this was a defection, a very exciting defection of a Soviet staffer and his wife. Released in May, the film was highly praised within government and commercial circles. The head of information of the Commonwealth Relations Office writes to Hawes to say, "The film is the very best thing I have ever seen in the true interests of the Commonwealth." Discussions carefully negotiated around the film's lack of box office success. That was seen as disloyal to mention it. distribution head of Greater Union, Norman Ridge, publicly noting that the real measure of the film's worth is in its archival value as a moving record of an historical occasion and the prestige which it has earned for Australia. So what was its value in these respects? As Hawes himself says, the film emerged, as I planned it, not as a film only of the royal couple, but of Australia itself, and of the people and the country. The film bears out the grand scheme, marrying tourist and immigration promotion to a story of a modern nation within Commonwealth, presenting the history of the present, which bypasses such minor historical matters as penal settlements, territorial acquisition, and very carefully current relations with the US, in favour of imagining an ongoingly harmonious white community, confidently defining the space and time of the nation, determining the places of its others. The vision is authorised in its presentation before the Crown and basks in the Crown's reflected glory. It's appropriative in its modes of being typically Australian, managing and marginalising first Australians via various visual analogues for assimilation. Australia's internal colonisation and Pacific sub-imperialism are as marginal as it is possible to imagine from the national story. And in this way, the film signals forthcoming Australian antipathy to the multiracial hues of the new Commonwealth. This is not a film about Australia in Asia or in the Pacific. Hawes writes to his News and Information Bureau head that he's happy with the opening that we saw, the opening montage. The cross-section of the country has some lovely material in it. It makes Australians want to go home, and it makes the English want to emigrate. I leave the last word with the US reviewer, who aptly describes the film as an expanded love story between a new sovereign and a new people in an old and durable political relationship.
Well, I mean, I feel totally inadequate, but you have a bouquet. Thank you very much, Jenny. That was extremely illuminating and a very good piece of work. I'm delighted to have discovered in the presence this year a whole new subgenre of documentary royal visit films, which obviously are well worth further study. So, on behalf of the University of London Screen Studies Group and the Royal Holloway and the Coffin Trust, please join us for drinks outside. As I said, we will be taking no questions for this session. So can we again thank Jane for